Hi, Jacqueline Timmer here, founder and director of the American Voters Alliance, formerly known as Got Freedom, and host of the Main Street podcast. I am here in the Main Street studio, and as many of you know, we have temporarily put production on hold due to a number of other projects that the team and I are working on. However, in our regularly scheduled slot with USLA, coming up right now, we are filling that place with my dad's podcast, First Principles. My father is former Kansas Attorney General Phill Kline. He is a law professor at Liberty University and director of the Amistad Project. So I'm sure that you will enjoy his podcast. Sometimes I co-host with him as well. So we'll be bringing that to you while we wrap up some of the projects on the AVA and Main Street side, and we'll be back with you shortly. So enjoy First Principles.
I'm Phill Kline, and you know, freedom is not complicated, although I'm concerned, and I have two guests with me today who I believe will join that concern, that freedom in this nation is becoming more difficult. And today I'm honored to have with me Ian Northon, who is an attorney from Michigan, Ian, through this past year, you and I have walked through some fire together. Ian is one of the attorneys that's part of the Amistad Project and always been a principled leader on some significant issues in Michigan, as well as our nation. And so I'm excited to have Ian with us today. And I also invited my daughter, Jacqueline Hillary Timmer, and you will hear me at times call her Hillary. Dad still calls her by her middle name, and she has graciously allowed me permission to do so. But her first name is Jacqueline, and she is the leader of the Got Freedom Project, and also spent some time with Ian in the current political environment that we face in this nation. Now, Ian, let me go to you. And first, thank you for all that you've done over the past year, and thanks for being with us today.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'm happy to be here. And when we first met, I don't know, some year to 18 months ago, I thought I was going to help out on a few obscure little projects, and instead we rolled up our sleeves and got after it a little bit. What I couldn't anticipate at the time was how much I would enjoy working with you. It's a pleasure to work with principled people, but I also didn't anticipate some of the backlash or the response that we got from folks from around the country.
And that's what I wanted to talk to you about to start out, Ian. And just in how I've come to know you, I know that you think that, and believe me, that is not as common as it used to be. But you think deeply about issues, and then you guide your conduct consistent with principles. And the people that I've met who really focus on that have a real love of the promise of America, what America has promised to become, and the core principles and truths that guide the delivery of that promise. And here's the question that I have for you. In this last 18 months of engagement, what about our nation do you believe most fundamentally is inconsistent with what our nation should and hope to be? What now manifests a wrong turn, do you believe?
Well, I mean, I suppose to answer that, Phil, I mean, there was a lot there, but to try to tackle a question like that, I have to go back to where I grew up. I'm a small town guy. I grew up in the Midwest in a small town in Michigan with one stoplight. And so I always dreamed as a young boy of being a professional baseball player. I remember giving a speech.
You're a pitcher, right?
That's right. I was.
Okay.
I remember giving a speech when I was like 7 or 8 years old about what do you want to be when you grow up, and lawyer was not on the list. It wasn't even on the top 10. I wanted to be a baseball player and a soldier, and so I grew up kind of America and apple pie, thinking of a patriotic way. And I'm the first guy in my family to graduate from college, let alone go on to law school. And so I went on a baseball scholarship. But my father was a reader, a deep reader, and there were books everywhere. And so it's pretty hard to grow up with books, surrounded by books everywhere, and not read a Madison or a Jefferson or a Tocqueville, and not come with this, idealistic version of America. Now, they were very realistic too. They dealt with problems in real time and did so in a way that I thought was not just principled, but also with an eye toward the problems that they didn't want to repeat. They were trying to distance themselves from an empire on the other end of the ocean that was causing all this mischief. That's why everyone came to America. They were escaping something. Whether it was political persecution, whether it was religious persecution, whether it was economic opportunity, everyone came to America for one of those reasons. And so it created this entrepreneurial spirit. It created all of those things that we talk about, America being such a great place for opportunity. It certainly was for me as a guy who could get, ultimately I didn't make it as a baseball player, right? You get fired enough times, you find something else to do, but it was strictly merit-based. It was you lived or died based on how well you did something. And so to me, that was the forge in which I kind of shaped my way of thinking. And what I saw with this most recent election cycle is that it was no longer about who did things best or why we were doing things a particular way. It was all about identity and all about who or which groups you identified with. You were picking winners and losers before the game was played. And instead of trying to do the best for your country or trying to do the best for your neighborhood or trying to do the best for your family, the winners and losers were already decided, and you were either with it or against it. And it created this kind of identity politics. It's been a trend. It's been trending for a long time, at least during my professional career. And so that was something that I saw shape those battle lines early. And that was unfortunate. There were people on both extremes of the aisle, political aisle, that had their minds made up, regardless of what actually happened in between. And that's dangerous because then the truth doesn't matter. If the truth doesn't matter, then it creates an opportunity for mischief and an opportunity for manipulation. And everyone's going to defend their position or their tribe, regardless of what the truth is. And that's one thing that, I remember, there was a lot of truth to throwing a baseball. If you threw a fastball right down the middle of the plate, the other side was going to hit it. You got immediate feedback. You knew that was a bad pitch. You found out right away. I gave up a home run one time. I don't think it's landed yet. And I got fired the next day. There was some truth to that. There was no sugarcoating it. And that, to me, we did not have in this political season. We did not have that kind of instant feedback. Everything was obfuscated by one layer or one euphemism after another. And that makes it really difficult to sort through when you're trying to do right by your clients or trying to do right by a particular political party or any number of other things. When everyone's mind is already made up, that's just going to increase the volatility and increase the frustrations.
Let me ask you, in your reading of de Tocqueville, of Madison, of Jefferson, in your studies of their lives, is there anything within their life or their writing or their thought that you disagree with?
Oh, sure. I mean, and that's what's interesting, right? Madison would maybe be more in favor of a centralized system, but whereas de Tocqueville talked about these decentralizations, these subsidiarities where things were being done at the lowest level, and he complimented America on that as successful, but didn't really understand why. Here you had a French aristocrat trying to explain why America was so successful, and he talked about its decentralization.
And in addition, with Jefferson, you had a man who wrote a beautiful truth that our rights are self-evident and gifted to us by a higher moral authority than government, and that is God Almighty. And we have intrinsic value that government should not diminish, yet own slaves.
And so that's also something that's very practical, which is I'm not perfect. Like I said, I grew up and made lots of mistakes growing up and still make mistakes today, both personally and professionally. But yet at the same time, ideas matter and the truth matters. And that's somebody to discount the truth that Thomas Jefferson said, and not just an actual reality. He was describing the world and people as they are, instead of trying to say, well, it's my truth or your truth. Well, that doesn't work in a real world. That doesn't reflect human nature. That creates this moral relativism that all the great thinkers warn against and warn about. If instead you look at reality as it is and understand that people are the same way now as they were in the late 1800s when they had the last big election dispute, right? And the vast patronage of the presidency and all the corruption and temptations that come with it create some really bad incentives for people who are just regular folks. And those temptations are too strong if we don't follow the laws as they're written. That's the great American experiment. What separates us from, from the governments that tried in the past and failed was always they kept giving into those passions by setting up these layers of protection, these bulwarks, and following the laws as they were written. It protected us from our own bad angels, as Madison would call it, or and so.
Well, in government implementing it, not protecting us from our own liberty, but protecting government from restricting that. It's interesting in this concept because you were able to see the beauty of the truth in the articulation and the thinking of men who were deeply flawed. And I believe some of what we're losing in this culture is what I've come to learn in my search for truth is that I must season it with grace. As I've received grace, I must extend grace to be able to see the beauty within the ugly. And there always is. There is, because we're in a broken world in many ways. And Jacqueline, you said it in some fashion the other day about when we were talking, I don't know if it was a dinner table but you said cancel culture doesn't allow room for
redemption.
Elaborate.
So in order to have relationship, you have to be able to work through conflict. Conflict is inevitable among people. And so with that, as cancel culture comes in, because it's saying, oh, if you have done this, therefore we can't listen to you, or if you have believed that, therefore we cannot interact with you, it removes the capacity to overcome. And Paul Johnson, a British historian, he commented on the US, and in the very beginning of his book, he's outlining what the US is and what the US promises, that all men are created equal. And with that comes certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He outlines the significance of that in the context of human history. And when he does that, he asks the promise, will America make good her audacious claims? And essentially what he's saying is, if the US is this revolutionary thing that comes with a unique promise in the context of human history that has never been promised before, and yet has these grievances and these stains throughout that history, can America make good on that promise? And what we're seeing right now is we're seeing a debate on whether those promises even matter. And so there is an attempt to undercut the promise itself in saying, oh, America has failed at this promise, so we're going to remove the promise altogether so that people are not offended, so that people aren't hurt, that at some point in history that there has been an exclusion or a deprivation. But if we remove the promise, then we remove the overcoming that has enabled us to get to a place of higher relationship and value.
Okay, and as I look at what I'm seeing now in America, and Ian, I want to ask you about this. I believe without the intercession of grace in relationship that stems from a respect for your intrinsic value, that means that we have to have sufficient respect to disagree, and disagree without canceling one another, and disagree without trying to attack identity. Without that, it's a mere struggle of power. And where did you see that? Are you seeing that in America?
Well, no, that's right. In other words, there was, if you look at people being made in the image of a creator or with dignity, even the most staunch atheists can agree that there's something unique about humans versus, the beasts of the field. And so if we've got something special, and you have to respect someone else's autonomy too, it's like a libertarian view, right? Do no harm. That's a situation where that creates space for disagreement because I have free will. I can think for myself. So if I think something different from you, you've got to give enough space to do that. You called it grace. It's the golden rule. Every major religion, every major civilization that's survived has got some version of the golden rule, to treat others as they wish to be treated. The problem we're seeing is that people aren't willing to do that. And I don't know if it's a lack of grace or a laziness, but they want government to do it for them. And unfortunately, we know from history that government can't do things on the person-to-person level. They can only do things at the point of a gun. In other words, we have our tax code. We have a voluntary system of taxes. If you don't comply, the IRS doesn't have many tools in its toolkit. It can audit you, or it can come in at the point of a gun. Guys can show up with guns and force you to do things. And if somebody disagrees in a political space or a religious space, rather than leave well enough alone or leave people alone so long as they're not harming others, they want to cancel them. They want to destroy them. They want to scorch the earth and then salt it behind them so that you can never replace it. I'll give you a quick example. I'm licensed in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida. I've moved around the country, first as a ball player, now as a lawyer. And in Florida, there's a large Hispanic population. And the left wanted to come after President Trump for comments that he made about the border, about mischief, about illegal immigration or undocumented workers. And the left wanted to cancel him and use that as leverage with a group of people and throw all Hispanics or Latinx into one category. But yet, if you look at the numbers down in Florida, President Trump polled very well and actually did very well in Florida among Hispanics because they're not all the same. Most folks, because they're hardwired the same way as everybody else, because humans are humans, regardless of where they're from or what their background is, want the same things. They want a safe place to raise their family, and they want economic opportunity. And so if you look at President Trump as somebody that was polarizing because of what he said and cancel him, then he can be of no intrinsic value, no redeeming value whatsoever. If, on the other hand, you'd say, well, what are your fruits? What are your policies? How do we know you? What's actually happening? Well, when Hispanics did that in Florida, they said, this guy's great for us. We've got more jobs, more opportunities. He wants law and order. He's stopping human trafficking. He's doing all these types of things that they want too, because they're human. In other words, if you look at people and know them by their fruit rather than just by what they say, that gives an opportunity then to look at public policy and see what the proper role of government is, instead of, as you said, just being a power struggle over who can get what, and then do so by temporarily taking over the reins of power of government and doing things at the point of a gun, forcing people to do things. Now, let's face it, that's all temporary.
Let's step into the raw exercise of power, because Jacqueline was up there in Michigan for quite some time. You, of course, are in Michigan. You were representing the Amistad Project as well as helping with Got Freedom and then as an independent attorney. And we saw some bold, raw exercises of power, some of it through statements creating implications and fear, some of it actually mobilizing law enforcement. And you said it, Ian, that government's tool is to compel people to behave or to act consistent with the desires of government. And it has little else as a tool. It's the power of the police. It's the power to compel you to do things you might not otherwise do. And we saw that through threat and through action. I'll identify a couple of the threats, and then I want to go to the locking down of the Capitol building, which Jacqueline covered for Got Freedom, and which you were representing alternative electors and Republican legislators. The governor of Michigan has taken the position, as many governors unfortunately have, but perpetually, that there's no way to get the citizens of Michigan to be concerned about the health of others except by threatening them with loss of licensure or through prison to compel them to act. And the Attorney General of Michigan has kind of inferred that, actually allowing a tweet out on her spokesperson's retweeting that lawmakers who don't believe the election should be certified should be investigated criminally. And then also there's the licensure issue, where they have put out the word that people who've represented the president or president's position should have their law license in jeopardy. Now, in the midst of all that, Republicans wanted to enter their Capitol building. Ian well, I'm going to turn to Jacqueline. Jacqueline, when you first went up there, kind of set the scene. And Ian, I want you to tell the inside story of what that was like.
Sure.
When the governor of Michigan shut down the Capitol building to Republicans only. So tell us about you going up there and what you walked into.
So we were coordinating with Ian, who is on the ground, as well as some other individuals as well. And driving up last minute, we were making a number of phone calls back and forth about how this was to unfold with the question of sending a dual set of electors.
Okay, so this is about the time that the states had the deadline of sending presidential electors under the Constitution to Congress. And the background of this is that the state legislature under the Constitution has that authority. That's where it's vested, each state legislature, and they elected, they could send two sets of electors or one. It was the choice of the state legislature. So you're going up into this environment. The media has declared Biden the winner, and there's talk that Michigan will send two sets rather than just one.
Due to the contention around the question of fraud in the 2020 presidential election, specifically in Michigan and specifically in Detroit, there was the question of sending dual electors in order to delay the vote until that question of fraud had been resolved.
In those areas.
Correct.
Okay.
And so with that, we were coordinating with Ian as far as covering this event because of the extensive actions of Governor Whitmer and how she had superseded her power on a number of occasions prior. And so there was a lot of tact and question going into how is this going to unfold, who is involved, and what is the proper process and procedure. One, because of the legality of the matter and the legal authority that was vested in the legislature that had been denied on a number of occasions, but also because of public persona, because of the way that messaging had been controlled. I'm going to do a quick caveat and come right back in. You know, being a millennial, growing up, and my education has essentially been that every single problem in our society goes back to capitalism, and that
That's what they taught you. Went to private school.
Well, okay, when I took social,
I feel like I failed as a father.
The professor hated me, so you can feel ashamed. But when I took social problems in school, every single issue that we went through, whether it was an issue of sex trafficking to poverty to racism, the theory behind it was always that capitalism was the issue. And so with that, you know, I have a very compassionate, passion-filled generation around me that is moved by mission. And so what has happened in the media narrative is before us that is a just cause, but framing it in a way where it creates foot soldiers for something that's completely other. And capitalism is the enemy, and the institution is the enemy. So when it comes to coming into this political environment, there's the question of how is this framed? How do we communicate this to a public who's already been indoctrinated in a way that they believe that Governor Whitmer is there to protect them from all these issues and to be the arbiter of compassion, so to speak.
So they've been taught that government is the repository, a necessary repository of this power,
right,
to protect us from evils such as capitalism and even liberty.
Correct. And there's no self-responsibility. So then coming into, that's a whole side note, but coming into that environment and then engaging with that, you know, we were talking with Ian and trying to figure out, okay, how is this going to unfold? And in the mix of that, Senator Shirkey had tipped off some friends of the left.
The president of the Senate did?
The president of the Senate had tipped off Governor
the
Whitmer.
Republican president of the Senate.
Yep. That we were coming and that the dual set of electors was coming forward on the Republican side, and that there was contention. And within the context of, I don't know, Ian, probably 15 minutes, she had called up 200 state troopers.
I think it was
around the Capitol.
But yeah, Jacqueline is right. I mean, this was a situation where we had a lot of drama unfolding very quickly. You know, Michigan had a long, hot summer. You know, it was shut down because of COVID. Michigan had some of the most restrictive COVID restrictions in the country. And because of that, there were riots in the streets. You know, places that hadn't seen civil unrest like that since the late 60s had seen violence. Downtowns like Grand Rapids and Detroit were boarded up. And so there had been riots unfolding all summer long, but with a very different mission. You know, the millennials had been riled up over defund the police and racial injustices or purported racial injustices, even though Michigan as a state has done wonders for race relations throughout my lifetime. And so here's a situation where all summer long, these things are festering and burgeoning, and the police are on edge. While there were no college graduates in my family, there were a ton of police officers. I have a lot of respect for law enforcement, and they're trying to figure all this out in real time and do the right thing and keep people safe. Well, hit the pause button on that and now roll into the election season and in November. And when we did that, the election in November happened, and immediately, the governor, seeing an opportunity, I believe, started to mobilize law enforcement in a way that was unprecedented. She started to claim that there were terrorist threats, domestic terrorist threats, when there were not. Interviews, media interviews that were unbiased, interviewed the state police and others. And, the Secretary of State's office said armed people were outside of her home threatening her and her children, while they were, getting ready for Christmas. And yet, when you interview the police officers who responded to the scene, say there were no guns, there were no weapons, there were no threats, there were peaceful protesters. And so there was a bit of this misinformation or this gaslighting going on, and that fed right into this volatility. When in fact, there was no volatility. There were no credible threats on the Capitol. There were no instances of unrest or fights breaking out like we had seen just months earlier.
Let me jump in and set the scene a little bit more, and then I want to talk about your confrontation with a state police officer in front of the Capitol doors, and so some Republicans had gathered to go through the process of certifying electors that were Trump electors to go to the Electoral College. Well, where also on that day there was a gathering to certify Biden electors to go to the Electoral College. Now, the tradition is that this occurs in the Capitol, and it's the legislature that actually makes this determination under the Constitution.
That's right. So taking those constitutional issues, if I could, this was a situation that occurred every 4 years, but people did so without really paying attention to what the statutes or Constitution said. It had become a habit. But if you actually look at the statutes, a set of electors is picked under Michigan law and the federal Constitution every 4 years for every political party that's on the ballot. So there was a slate of Democrat electors because they're on the ballot, a slate of Republican electors because they're on the ballot, and even the Libertarians and Green Party candidates, because they were on the ballot in Michigan, they had a slate of electors. And the way it's supposed to work under Michigan statute is they convene at the Capitol, the People's House, at a certain time, in this case, 2 p.m. on an appointed date under a statute. And that was following their federal or U.S. constitutional duty. And what happened here is that the governor, the chief executive officer, hijacked that process. They kicked the legislature out of the People's House. They could no longer access their own building. And
tell me about that. How?
It was through a press release and through executive action, executive fiat. She said first thing in the morning that the building would be closed to all outsiders, except those that were previously appointed, the Democrat electors, because of COVID. So she issues a press release under her executive power under the Health and Human Services mandate, calling it COVID or blaming COVID. That was what the press release said. A few hours later, the reason was changed to now not being because of COVID, but because of credible threats, they called it. Now, when we asked the state police and when reporters asked the state police, there was no actual evidence of any credible threats. Quite the opposite. This seems to be something manufactured to keep not just the Republicans, but all legislators out except for her handpicked elite, the oligarchs who were close to her ear.
So I saw video, Got Freedom video, of you kind of walking with a group of Republican legislators and electors towards the Michigan Capitol building, and they're blocking you as a police officer.
Yep.
And you engaged in conversation with that police officer. My understanding is at the same time, I was a legislator in Kansas, and I could access that building anytime with a magnetic swipe card. That allowed me in. It was the key. That the governor, had ordered that these cards carried by Republican legislators be disabled.
Yeah,
they couldn't get in.
That's my understanding too. So it was really shocking. So I was actually there only to help with some paperwork. Like I said, I'm a lawyer. And so this alternate slate of electors was doing some paperwork. I wanted to help ensure based on behalf of the Amistad Project and others that the paperwork was done properly. This hadn't been done in Michigan ever, and it hadn't been done nationwide since the 1960s when an alternate slate had gone. So there were statutes in place that we wanted to try and comply with. And again, the statute says your slate of electors needs to be at this place at this time, and present that to the Senate Sergeant at Arms. So that was what was being done. I helped with some paperwork about 6 blocks away or so. Then all of a sudden I get a call from some state reps, some elected officials, actual elected officials, members of the Michigan legislature, who said, we can't get in the building. We've been locked out. Our key cards have been turned off. And so they went now to another entrance to try to get in. They were with the Michigan electors, this alternate slate. And again, the U.S. Constitution, under a federal statute, says if the election is in controversy. That's not a defined term. We don't have good case law on what that means. It just says if it's in controversy. And with, at the time, there were more than a dozen cases pending in Michigan. I think the number approached 15 or 20 at one point. With all those cases pending, to me, there's a good faith argument that that's, quote, in controversy. So the safe thing to do was what Hawaii did in the 1960s, which is to send another slate of electors. So I get this call, I'm 6 blocks away, that says, we've been locked out of the building. Help us, can you get here? So we go up, I go up, I rendezvous and meet those elected officials with the electors. And look, electors are typically ceremonial. Some of them were octogenarians in their 80s because their grandfather had been elector, when, 60 years ago and stuff.
Watch the age stuff.
Well, all right.
Okay, just time.
But as the bottom end of the Generation X, we've got a millennial on the line, we've got others on the line. I don't want to insult anybody's age, but I'm there with a group of elected officials, and then by and large, a couple of little old ladies, proverbial little old ladies, trying to get into the building, try to be there at the statutorily appointed time, and state troopers, guys wearing their body shields, I'm a big guy, I'm like 6'4", but they're, 6 foot something, they're armed to the teeth, they're wearing riot gear, and they say, little old lady, you can't come in. So they called me as their lawyer and said, help us, what's going on? So I approach the state trooper and was politely declined entry. I tried to explain which statute we were trying to comply with. I tried to explain who I was with. They had identification, they had their proper paperwork, and yet they were denied entry. And we could not get an excuse or a reason out of the state police, because I think at that time, the reasons given by the governor in the press release and then the later releases had already changed twice. And so they were probably instructed to just deny entry. I don't know exactly what was happening behind the scenes with the state police, but they were in a tough spot. The chief.
Now, let me ask you, the other electors, the Biden electors were in the building at that time, right?
Well, not only were they in the building, but they were going through, meeting at the appropriate place at the appropriate time. They were warm. It was cold outside. We're talking December in Michigan. So while my little old lady clients are outside freezing, the Democrats are warm, safe inside, and celebrating not just that their candidate's elector was being sent to Washington under the same statute we were trying to comply with, but celebrating that they had a political win. They kept us out of the building, kept us out of the people's house, and did so in a very aggressive way, using the police power of the state. I believe it was an abuse of power. I think it was a fairly rank abuse of power, and we've received no justification for it since.
Let me summarize a couple of things, and I have a closing question for both of you, and I think this is particularly pertinent as razor wire and fencing surrounds our nation's capital now. Not only the Capitol building, but the mall and areas where we celebrate American freedom. And it's shocking to me in the context. I've always believed that a nation that cherishes individual freedom must have the courage to vigorously defend the freedom of others with whom they disagree, and to have faith that a vigorous national debate is significant and helps a democracy grow in strength. And our trend towards criminalizing speech, to calling speech violence, to identity politics is really a threat to this. Now, what we've got going in Michigan is you're standing in front of the Capitol as you are filming, and I will ask our producers if possible, before we conclude, to show that film as a part of this podcast, because it's stunning to me that this film was made by Got Freedom, that the experience is real, and that America did not raise their voice in condemnation of the petty tyrant tactics of Michigan governance. They had threatened lawyers representing those with whom they disagree with a loss of professional licensure. They had allowed the implication that legislators who didn't agree that the election was actually without question could be criminally investigated and prosecuted. Now, the governor is deciding which people can have access to the people's house and which cannot. And using police to prevent those with whom she disagrees from gaining access to their own offices where they represent the people. What does this mean to America? And I want to start, Jacqueline, with you. In your mind, your generation, and then I'm going to have Ian to summarize it. What does this allowance, this acceptance, she's still in power, no one is calling for her to be removed, no one is even condemning this in a broad way. What does this mean to the future of America?
Well, if it continues, it means the end. But I don't think we're there yet. And the reason I don't think we're there yet is because as my team and I were traveling, it's the first time ever I hear everyone asking, what can we do? What can we do? How can I engage with this issue? What's my part? And when we were originally founded as a nation, that was the presumption of the founders. I mean, Ian mentioned de Tocqueville earlier, and de Tocqueville specifically talks about that America starts with this presupposition that the individual citizens will be knowledgeable and involved. But right now what we have is we have the middleman, and we have the middleman, which is media, and most people do not know what is taking place. And I believe if they did, we'd have more people asking that very question. What can I do? What's my role in engagement? So if this continues, it is the end of American freedom because it centralizes that freedom in a specific individual or specific position of power. But and I have to disagree with you on one thing, just because I'm your daughter and it's fun.
Well,
and then I'll let Ian take over and redeem it.
I'm giving you the dad look.
Okay.
All right. You have to overcome that.
But at the very beginning, you said, and I'm trying to remember the exact wording because I don't want to misrepresent you, Dad. But you
don't worry,
you'll correct me. But you were talking about freedom, and you were talking about essentially this is being an end to American freedom. And I know I used that phrase very similarly to you a minute ago. But freedom begins with the individual. Freedom is actually an individual choice. We always have a choice on how we are going to act or how we are going to express or how we are going to react to a situation, and that can never be taken from us. Situations can be changed, but we always have the ability to engage it. And so I believe that as we shift from this focus of, oh, my freedoms are being taken, to how do I, as an individual person with self-responsibility, express myself in this situation from a position of freedom, because that freedom is granted to me by God and not government, we're going to see a shift in our nation because people will start acting with the authority that we have and the authority that determined how our government was designed and intended to function. So I think the people need to fill that vacuum and fill that gap.
No, I believe that's great. We live in a time where we can't be ambivalent about our liberty. We have to choose to express it. Unfortunately, we live in a time where choosing to express it carries a risk. It carries a risk, but it is still a choice. So we have to be intentional. Thank you. And Ian, your thought?
I think that's right. You were questioning your educational choices for your daughter earlier, but I think she's done pretty well for herself. But no, you're absolutely right, and that's the same thing that I want for my own family. I'm considered middle-aged, right? And rather than have a mid-age crisis, I'd like to have a country, the country that I grew up in, to be a good place for my parents in their retirement. A good place for them, the ones who gave me these values in the first place. I'd like them to be able to enjoy the fruits of that. Likewise, I want a good place for my children to grow and thrive and be successful. And I'm seeing so many threats to that. But I think it was Solzhenitsyn who was talking about, when he's locked away in the gulags, and talking about it's easy to blame the government and the tyrants and the totalitarians, but he was talking about the lies that he told and his own personal responsibility, almost in an extreme way for his being there. And I think that's the fight that we all have to have, in our own hearts. Instead of waiting for someone else to give me liberty, where can I take back or assert my own liberty? And where can I be honest, not just with the process, but with those around me, to stand up to untruths, to stand up and fight for the just causes. I think that's essential. I represented in Michigan, some strong Black women, African-American women from Wayne and Macomb County, who were sick and tired of corruption and they and others like them being used as a pawn in a political game. And so they took it upon themselves to say, no, that's not what my parents and their grandparents fought for generations. And so by representing them and doing it in the right way, I thought I was able to fight back against some of that and help tell the truth a little bit. I didn't get the results that I wanted. And I faced some reprisals and some threats from the Attorney General's office or others. But ultimately, I believe that by doing things the right way, I've set a good example for my own children. I've done things that my parents can be proud of, whether they agree with my politics or not. And I hope that's a message for your listeners, which is, it's let's start with ourselves. Clean up your own room, so to speak, before you tell someone else to clean up theirs. Take the plank out of your own eye. And once you start doing that, then the political process becomes pretty obvious. You can see people who are corrupt, or you can see people who are manipulating once you start paying attention to it. And then, the answer to what can I do, or how do I go from here, or where do I go from here? There's any number of things that you can do. You can start small, and you don't eat an elephant in one bite. You eat it one bite at a time. And so there's a lot of work to be done to protect our country, but I think it's something that we can all start chewing, and it will make it a better place for everyone, not just some sort of political elite or some sort of connected class. It'll be an opportunity for everybody, like I enjoyed when I was growing up.
Thank you, Ian. I greatly appreciate not only you joining us today, but the honor of working with you. And you bring a lot to the table, and it makes a difference. And Jacqueline, I think I've told you this before, but one of the greatest blessings I've had in life is the opportunity to work in cause with my daughter, and actually to learn from my daughter as well. So let me just close with this observation. So much of this is where you place your hope. Hope is a necessary part of everybody's life. And if you look at the Constitution, the hope in the Constitution was placed in the truths that are reflected in that document, and in the genius of liberty, in the belief that a people can still cohere with different values, different belief systems, if liberty was the fundamental objective of governments. And so they erected some barriers between government and the people to protect the people. That's where they had their faith, in the people. If you go to Washington, D.C., there are other barriers now. They are physical barriers. They are lines of demarcation that cannot be crossed, and they're protecting where America, unfortunately, and its leaders today believe that hope is found. And it's in the Capitol building, and it's in the White House. And they see a threat to their hope, and it's you. Now the barrier is to keep you away from those in power. That is a dramatic threat to individual freedom and liberty. And just as both Ian and Jacqueline have said, we need to raise our voice now. Thank you. This is Phill Kline. I greatly appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you so much for staying tuned for First Principles. We look forward to connecting with you again next week.